The moment he said it, "This whole compliance process is a joke," I felt my hands tighten just slightly around the envelope I'd been holding. It was 6:37 a.m. on the dot, and the boardroom smelled like burnt espresso and unearned confidence. The new COO stood there like he was auditioning for a tech bro documentary, sleeves rolled, jaw clenched, talking like the room owed him applause. The department heads gave polite nods. One of the younger investors actually chuckled, trying to be seen. The chairman didn't flinch, but I watched the corner of his jaw twitch once, just once, like someone fighting the instinct to swat a fly. I waited, let the silence hang a few beats longer. Then I slid my resignation letter onto the table, face up. The COO's eyes dropped to it, scanned the top. I saw the recognition. Then that look, the one men like him wear when they think they've won. Smug satisfaction, pulled tight behind a thin smile. He assumed I was folding, that I was one of the many who'd get tired of being steamrolled and choose to walk away quietly. That's when the chairman leaned forward and said, calm as a glacier, "Meet me in my office, 9 minutes." Hey, if you've made it this far, take a second to like this video and subscribe. It's a small gesture, but it really motivates the team to keep bringing these stories to life. I stood without a word and walked out. My heels didn't echo like his did. His steps always needed to announce themselves. Mine just landed where they needed to. In the hallway, the morning sun was cutting through the atrium glass, slicing light across the floor like a sundial. Time was always a presence in this building. Every project had a deadline. Every deal had a window. Every failure had a fuse. What he didn't realize, what none of them realized, was that my resignation wasn't a retreat. It was a trigger, a mechanism, a key turned in a lock they never even knew existed. 6 months ago, I started preparing for this exact moment. The quiet erosion of the compliance framework started when he arrived. Slowly at first, quorum protocols removed, chain of custody procedures downgraded, escalation matrices rewritten to run through him alone. He called it streamlining. I called it structural amnesia. They were gutting safeguards for optics, cutting complexity so investors could be fed buzzwords like agile and lean. But real compliance doesn't care about buzzwords. It's not loud. It's not flashy. It doesn't pitch itself in meetings. It's a system of bones under muscle, invisible until it breaks. And I'd spent the better part of a decade building those bones. By the time I reached the elevator, I could already feel it beginning. The systems that had recognized my credentials as custodian of record were starting their 23-step cascade. A resignation at precisely 6:37 a.m. wasn't just symbolic. It activated a chain reaction coded into our governance infrastructure 3 years ago, signed off during a dormant compliance cycle that no one else bothered to read. Clause 14.9a, buried in a footnote, assigned emergency chain of custody revalidation to the named custodian upon resignation, unless a certified successor was in place. And there wasn't, because he'd never thought to appoint one. 9 minutes. That's all I had before the chairman's office. But in that 9 minutes, the first lock would engage, not metaphorically, literally. Credential rotation would begin, systems would flag missing sign-offs. Reporting tools would fail to reconcile Delta logs with audit trails. And every override request would stall on one phrase, "Custodian not recognized, please contact governance authority." The elevator doors opened to the executive level. I stepped out into silence, the hum of the building just a little different now, like something deep in the system had started breathing on its own. I didn't walk faster. I didn't check my watch. I didn't need to. Time was already moving. And this time it was on my side. They called it optimization. Centralize this, eliminate that. Always spoken with that smug tech startup cadence, like the fewer hands touching something, the smarter they were for it. Compliance to them was a checkbox, something to glance at after a quarterly refresh. But I've seen what happens when you gut the nervous system and expect the body to walk. You don't notice the failure right away. It doesn't scream. It hums, faintly, then collapses. The COO's first order of business was reducing friction. What that really meant was dissolving every multi-step approval process into a single button labeled yes. Quorum chains? Gone. Distributed validations? Too slow. Escalation trees with legal observers? Replaced by trusted delegate signatures, usually his own. He framed it all as progress. The board let him. He was young, loud, and confident. Confidence, as I've learned, is the cheapest currency in a room full of cowards who want to feel brave. But I wasn't hired for confidence. I was hired for containment. So I watched. I took notes, and one day I opened a new terminal on a segmented system no one monitored anymore because they didn't know it existed. We used to call it the Deep Compliance Layer, DCL for short, built during our initial SEC structuring phase. They never dismantled it because they never even knew it had been real. To them, it was part of the demo environment, but I'd kept it alive. Quietly, subtly, replicated nightly snapshots. Printed signatures stored in fireproof safes across 3 legal districts, a chain of custody that didn't rely on their systems or their oversight, just mine. While they were stripping down security protocols for the sake of velocity, I was quietly reinforcing every abandoned rule with mirrors. For every override they authorized, I logged it. For every audit trail they purged, I notarized a backup. For every quorum they dissolved, I logged the time, the method, and the clause they were violating, not to punish, but to preserve. Because here's the thing, when you strip out compliance, you don't just remove safeguards, you remove your ability to prove innocence, or intent, or ignorance. And they'd removed a lot. I never made speeches, never pushed back in meetings. I smiled, nodded, let them think I'd been neutralized. Meanwhile, I was building something stronger in the dark. An immutable ledger, not cloud-based, not stored on company servers, fully air-gapped, secured with biometric key splitting that only reassembled when I authenticated from 3 separate physical devices. Redundant, paranoid, old school. They'd call it overkill, until they'd need it, and they would. Clause 8.2b. I remember the day I wrote it, back when we were still small enough to share ideas over late-night pizza in the war room. It was buried inside a contingency protocol for structural failure. Back then, we thought it might help in a natural disaster. Turns out, the real disaster came with an MBA and a Pinterest board full of hustle quotes. That clause? It states that in the event of a custodian resignation with no certified successor, any attempt to activate a single signature override triggers a system delay, requiring dual compliance authorization unless the legacy custodian protocol is explicitly revoked in writing, which it never was, because he didn't even know to look for it. So when I walked out that door, the system didn't just lose a user, it lost its heartbeat. The rotation began at 6:59 a.m., 3 minutes after I left the boardroom. The system logged custodian active equals false and started initiating fallback procedures. Credential pairs began to expire. Session tokens started requiring biometric reconfirmation. And my shadow system? It came online. Slowly, silently, like floodgates hissing open beneath the surface of a still lake. I didn't need to press a button or make a call. All I had to do was stop being there, because that's what I'd built, a safeguard not based on presence, but on absence. Let them laugh at compliance, let them call it a joke. In 20 minutes, that joke would be the only thing standing between them and federal breach notifications. And the punchline? They'd have to say my name to fix it. The funny thing is, I wasn't even at a terminal when it happened. I was standing in the lobby sipping lukewarm coffee from the downstairs cafe, listening to a janitor grumble about the new soap dispensers. At exactly 7 a.m., I felt it, like a gear slipping into place somewhere deep in the machinery I used to call home. I didn't have to watch the screen. I knew the line by heart. If custodian.active equals false, begin audit lockdown. It was something I'd written in a moment of private clarity 2 years ago. I'd called it Protocol Lazarus, half joking with myself about bringing the system back from the dead if they ever tried to bury it. It didn't need human input, no click, no prompt, just a status change. My status. By the time the lobby clock rolled to 7:01, internal credentials began rotating. Not just the surface-level admin passes, but the root command structures. The ones buried beneath layers of interface fluff the new regime never understood. The ones that actually controlled whether a policy file could be written, whether a system architecture could be altered, whether a board report would load with approved at the top or a blank red error square instead. And just like that, every critical control file on the internal compliance grid began demanding biometric reconfirmation. Not a password, not a badge, a physical presence. And mine had just been revoked, which meant the system was now holding its breath. The chairman didn't know it yet, sitting in his glass office 2 floors up, scrolling through early reports. The COO certainly didn't know, still polishing his metaphors for the 8 a.m. board session. But somewhere in the bowels of our infrastructure, servers humming in their cage racks, heat slowly building, there was a cascade of quiet refusals. Denied. Authentication expired. Session token invalid. Override paused. Secondary signature not verified. See, this wasn't sabotage. I didn't tamper with anything. I didn't delete files or alter logs. I didn't plant a virus, as one of the analysts would later speculate. All I did was leave, because the compliance framework had been written around continuity, around human anchors. You don't automate accountability, you tie it to someone, and once that someone steps away, you better have a valid succession path. They didn't, because he thought he didn't need one. Audit Lock Protocol v2.3 wasn't even visible unless you were running compliance in legacy hybrid mode, which of course they deprecated 6 months ago in favor of a streamlined cloud compliance layer. Faster, sexier, and investor-facing, I remember him saying, like he was describing a car. But he didn't know what was hiding under the hood. The protocol prevents unauthorized structure changes post-custodian resignation. Any attempt to reassign ownership, overwrite privilege tables, or even generate new reporting templates requires an active custodian token or dual authorization from a certified compliance pair. There were no pairs, there was no token, just silence, and a slowly building backlog of requests, transactions, reports, all queued, all frozen. I didn't need to see the logs. I knew how it would unfold. At 7:03, the first scheduled compliance validation for the Silver Ridge Capital Partnership pipeline would stall. Their access nodes were part of a sandboxed handshake that required periodic reauthorization, based on my signature chain. When that didn't come through, the system would assume compromise and suspend the external handshake. By 7:06, the data warehouse ingestion from the CRM side would start throwing errors, partial loads, inconsistent mapping, because the new rules they'd shoved in last quarter relied on a shortcut validator I never formally endorsed. And by 7:10, the first red flag would land in the system health dashboard upstairs. Quiet, blinking. It wouldn't say crisis, it would say non-standard event pattern detected. That's the beauty of well-written fail-safes. They don't scream, they just stop letting you lie. And somewhere, sitting in a sleek chair in a boardroom filled with coffee cups and curated optimism, he'd start to feel it, the subtle unraveling. The slide deck wouldn't load right. The embedded data callout would throw a null. A question would be asked. Then another. Why is the quorum validation stuck? Did we lose the reporting bridge? Who's our designated compliance anchor? And the answer would sit there embedded in a line of system code and a clause no one bothered to read. Custodian, inactive. Protocol, lockdown active, override, denied. The buildings still looked the same. The people still walked the halls. But beneath them, the spine had gone stiff. The heartbeat was stalled. The body was awake, but paralyzed. And no one, not a single one of them, knew yet that they'd just lost the only person who could unfreeze it. He walked into that boardroom like he owned it. Not rented, owned. You could see it in his stride in the way he tugged his sleeves just so before clicking the remote. A branded slide deck projected behind him, blue gradients and buzzwords spinning like a carnival ride for the suits. He opened with a line about evolution, compared our compliance restructuring to shedding skin, and then dropped the number. We've cut compliance processing time by 62%. There was a pause, just long enough for him to enjoy it. Then came the real test. One of the Silver Ridge Capital partners, Daria Solin, leaned forward, chin resting lightly on steepled fingers. And validation? She asked, voice like polished glass. The COO smiled, a little too wide. Automated now. Fully hands-off. Seamless chain integration, all cross-checked against the reporting layer. He didn't see it. Not yet. But Daria did. Her gaze flicked to the monitor in front of her. Slide 17 had just loaded, the one with the big circular graphic and 4 stacked stats in green. But at the bottom, nearly invisible against the branded footer, was a flickering line of text. Validation expired. Quorum not met. She didn't say anything, not yet. Professionals like her wait. They don't challenge with emotion. They wait for proof to speak. The COO kept talking. Some nonsense about decentralized confidence, a phrase that doesn't mean anything but sounds like it should. Behind him, the presentation timer ticked forward. At exactly 7:58, 2 minutes before he stepped on stage, the validation server had entered standby mode. Why? Because it was built to expect a handshake every 90 minutes, a dual signature override to confirm the validity of all outgoing and incoming compliance data flows. With my resignation active and no certified successor in place, the server did what it was trained to do. It waited. And when no valid dual signature arrived, it began shutting down access to critical files, not deleting them, just pausing, like a librarian refusing to hand over a book until you show the right card. Back in the room, he was clicking to slide 21, the vision forward nonsense. He didn't even notice that some of the graphs weren't rendering. The embedded charts were drawing from a live data feed that had just been suspended. Instead of projections, the display showed a static fallback table with a note in the corner. Data source unresolved, awaiting confirmation token. Still, he didn't stop, because people like him don't check under the hood. They just rev the engine louder. At the back of the room, I stood near the coffee station. The chairman had invited me to observe as a courtesy. I didn't speak. I didn't even sip my cup. I just watched. Watched as the COO wrapped his pitch with a line that would become infamous by noon. We've eliminated the need for legacy compliance handlers entirely. I imagine that's when Daria Solin made her mental note. She didn't flinch. She just tapped her stylus once against the edge of her screen and wrote something I couldn't see. Her associates followed suit, each with that subtle pause, the kind that says, "We're not reacting now, but we're documenting everything." He thought he'd sold it, smiled like he'd just closed a Series C. Then the chairman cleared his throat. "Can you open the live validation dashboard?" he asked. The COO hesitated. "We typically summarize that post-pitch." "Open it," the chairman repeated. His tone wasn't loud, but it carried. A technician near the wall moved to comply, tapping on the tablet tethered to the presentation feed. The main screen shifted. Blue screen, then gray. Then, error. Governance protocol, paused reason. Custodian not recognized. Someone coughed. Daria leaned back slightly in her chair. "You mentioned it was fully automated," she said, no malice in her tone. Just curiosity sharpened into steel. The COO turned toward the screen, face stiffening. This must be a caching issue. We'll just refresh." He clicked. Nothing changed, because there was nothing to refresh. At 8:01, the internal credential map had rotated. At 8:03, the override channels failed to establish quorum. By 8:05, the entire validation substack moved to standby. And at 8:10, just as he was boasting about eliminating bloat, every node pinged the same message. Override suspended. Custodian signature required. The room didn't explode. These weren't people who panicked, but I watched it in their eyes. The slow dawning of confusion giving way to unease. A realization crawling across the conference table like spilled ink. He was still talking, reassuring, spinning, but no one was listening anymore, because the dashboard didn't care about charisma. It just needed one thing, my signature, and it wasn't coming. Not until they asked the right question, and not until he realized he had walked into the boardroom with a megaphone, only to find out the building had gone soundproof. At exactly 8:37 a.m., the presentation glitched. Not in a dramatic, cinematic kind of way. No alarms, no smoke, just a flicker. A momentary dim of the projector light, the kind of thing you'd normally blame on HDMI lag or a bad wireless connection. But that flicker, it was the moment the system made its final decision. 1 hour after my resignation, the last chain of custody flag hit its timeout. Document control locked itself. Regulatory reporting froze mid-transfer. Escalation scripts, which had been running in the background for years without anyone acknowledging their value, suddenly demanded authentication from a user profile that no longer existed. And then the message appeared, projected in large font across the main boardroom screen. Black text on a white background. Plain, unblinking, custodian not recognized. Please contact governance authority. The room didn't react at first. Not because they didn't understand, it was because they did. That phrase had been floating in the margins of internal playbooks for years. A leftover line from our early SEC chartering days. No one ever thought it would surface. Certainly not during a live investor session with half the senior team present and a freshly minted COO trying to secure another funding tranche. He stared at it like it had personally betrayed him, like it had stolen the punchline to his TED Talk. His mouth opened, half-formed explanations already queuing up behind his teeth, but nothing came out. The silence spread, slow and sticky, like molasses down an air vent. Someone near the window broke it. A younger compliance analyst, one of the few who hadn't been purged during his efficiency refresh. Her voice was tentative. "Who's our governance authority?" You'd think someone would answer that instantly, like saying the name of the fire marshal during a drill. But no one did. Not legal, not risk, not the chairman, because they all knew. The 2019 compliance charter, drafted during the company's federal restructuring phase, named only one person as governance authority. Me. Not the title, not the role, the name. Governance wasn't abstract. It wasn't a department, it was anchored. And they'd never recertified a successor, never even read far enough to know they needed to. Because as long as I was around, things just worked. That's the problem with invisible systems. You only notice them when they stop saving you. He finally broke the silence. "Okay, this is a formality. Let's just route through legal." The chairman didn't move. Legal can't authorize credential reinstatement, not without compliance quorum. The COO looked around, confused. "We have quorum." "No," Daria Solin cut in, cool and firm. "You have a meeting. That's not the same." His voice sharpened. "Then escalate to audit systems." Another quiet voice from the back. "Audit scripts are frozen pending re-auth." "And who the hell programmed that?" I stepped forward then, not to gloat, not even to claim victory, just to clarify. "I did," I said simply. "Back in 19, after the data integrity scare." He turned toward me slowly, like someone realizing the floor beneath them isn't as solid as they thought. "You built this in?" "No," I replied. "I preserved it. You built around it. I made sure the foundation still had teeth." He scoffed, gesturing to the screen. "So what, you think this proves you're irreplaceable?" I tilted my head. "No, I think this proves I was never supposed to need replacing." That landed hard. The systems weren't failing, they were protecting. That was the entire point. The lockdown wasn't a bug. It was a defense mechanism, triggered only when the organization could no longer prove it had a valid compliance spine. They'd bragged about streamlining everything. What they'd really done was amputate their immune system. Now they were standing in a crowded room full of investors, unable to produce a single validated compliance certificate, because the one person legally authorized to approve the override had already walked out the front door and left behind a perfectly silent firewall that only knew one thing: you don't trade stability for speed without consequences. And now, those consequences were quietly multiplying across every corner of the business, line by line, rule by rule, waiting for someone to admit they'd made a mistake. At 8:46 a.m., I knocked once and entered. The chairman's office was dimmer than usual, blinds half drawn, a haze of early sunlight making slow stripes across the carpet. He was seated at the far end, back straight, hands folded, but his eyes were locked on the frozen dashboard feed glowing from his screen. All the systems we'd once quietly agreed were non-negotiable now bore the same status banner: custodian not recognized. He didn't look up as I stepped inside, just murmured, "You built the backbone." I walked forward, calm but deliberate. "I enforced the spine," I said. "You all just forgot it was there." That made him look up. He wasn't angry, not confused, just older than he looked yesterday. "It's asking for your signature," he said. I stopped across from him, "Not unless the sovereign compliance clause is invoked." That phrase had weight. We both knew it. Clause 14.9a had been my final line of defense, drafted in a long-forgotten strategy session during the early government compliance build-out. It was designed for only one situation: when the governance function was unintentionally severed and no certified successor had been appointed. If that clause was activated, my authority returned, not as staff, not as employee, but as sovereign custodian with legal veto, operational freeze privileges, and direct board advisory access. He exhaled slowly, not defeat, not resistance, just the tired breath of a man who finally accepted reality. "We're invoking it." For a beat, nothing moved. Then I opened my laptop and plugged in a small black drive, not company property, not synced to the cloud, just a physical key, one of 3. The others were in separate safes, across jurisdictions. This was the only one that ever left my sight. I tapped in a password, The drive began to hum faintly, its internal hardware key triggering handshake verifications across dormant compliance layers. On his screen, the dashboard flickered. Connection reestablished. He leaned back, watching the systems begin to respond to the buried authority signal. "You planned this." I didn't respond. Because it wasn't a plan. It was protection. The kind of insurance you build when you've spent years watching decisions get made by people who treat compliance like napkin math. When you've sat in meetings listening to execs talk about gut feel while you're still holding the forensic logs of their last shortcut. After a pause, he said, "They think this is sabotage." "They always do," I replied, "when they find out the brakes were real." He didn't laugh, just stared at the message now pulsing on his display. Sovereign custodian authorization required. Proceed. YYN. He turned the screen slightly toward me. "This gives you full control." "No," I said. "This restores control. There's a difference." He hovered over the prompt, then clicked Y. The system spun once, then loaded a new screen. Clause 14.9A invoked. Legacy custodian signature required. I picked up the stylus and signed. Just 4 strokes of my hand, but they felt like years of withheld breath finally exhaled. The systems began waking up, one by one, slowly, like a sleeping giant uncoiling. The chairman watched in silence, then said, "They're going to want to renegotiate." I nodded, and I'm ready. Because reinstatement at this point wouldn't be ceremonial. It wouldn't be a title or a desk or some limp apology behind closed doors. It would be terms, strict ones. And next time, they wouldn't be written in bullet points on a slide. They'd be embedded in the code, in the architecture, in every override path and every protocol clause they once called overcautious. I turned to leave, pausing only to say, "Tell them to clear their next hour. I'll need the room." And as I walked out, the lights across the executive floor flickered once, not failing, rebooting. I walked into the boardroom with nothing but a single sheet of paper in my hand. No presentation, no bravado, just bullet points. 5 of them. Simple, clean, irreversible. And the moment I placed the page in front of the chairman, the silence wrapped around the room like shrink wrap. No rustling papers, no sidebar whispers. Just the kind of stillness that happens when people finally realize they're not negotiating with a colleague anymore, but with the firewall they didn't know they needed. "I'll make this brief," I said, and I did. Reinstated as head of compliance, reporting directly to the board. Not legal, not operations, direct. No executive may override without dual legal quorum, not even the CEO and especially not the COO. All changes to chain of custody require my signature, hand-signed, time-stamped, and counter-notarized through protocol. The COO, who openly mocked the function that just saved this company, is to be barred from accessing any compliance systems, dashboards, or override pathways for a minimum of 12 months. And finally, the shadow ledger, the one I'd quietly maintained and protected while they gutted the framework, is to be absorbed into the official record. Permanently, line for line, timestamp for timestamp, 0 edits. When I finished reading, I didn't ask for questions. I didn't need a vote, because they all knew. This wasn't a power grab. It was triage, and I was the only one with the credentials to stop the bleeding. The chairman read it once, top to bottom, then nodded. "Agreed," he said quietly. One word to confirm that the air had shifted, that the table had turned. Not flipped, just turned, slowly, irrevocably, like a tide pulling back before it hits harder. The rest of the board followed, eyes low, expressions unreadable. But I saw it, the recognition. Not fear, not admiration. Something older, institutional necessity. The kind that forces people to remember why systems were built the way they were in the first place. A lawyer in the corner leaned over to make an amendment, and I raised my hand. "One more thing," I said. Then I added a final line at the bottom of the page in pen. All board members must re-sign the Operational Integrity Pact. Original clause formatting, no summary red lines. Full commitment. That got a reaction. The Integrity Pact was dusty, tucked into our founding compliance documents. It required every sitting board member to formally acknowledge the chain of command hierarchy, the limits of override privileges, and the absolute authority of the custodian during structural lockdown events. Most hadn't touched it in years. Some had probably forgotten it existed. But if I was walking back into this storm, I wasn't doing it alone. They'd sign, every one of them, or the system would simply remain frozen. And they all knew that was the kind of gridlock investors don't forgive. By the time I sat down, the chairman had already handed the page to legal. They didn't even push back, just took it and began prepping signatures. And across the table, the COO, quiet now, slumped behind a laptop he no longer understood, finally looked up at me. He opened his mouth, closed it again. Because what could he say? The system no longer listened to him. The signatures were being gathered. The pact was being reinstated. And the company was learning painfully that the woman they tried to write out of the chain was the chain. There was no gloating, no smugness, just paperwork and silence, exactly the way it was always meant to be. They sat him down at the far end of the conference table, the same seat he'd occupied during the rollout meetings, the same seat from which he once smirked and said compliance was just a cover-your-ass department for people too scared to lead. Now, he looked like a man trying to recognize a country he used to mock from the window of a plane. The chairman slid the laptop across the table. The screen was black, save for a single terminal window and a flashing cursor. No GUI, no dashboards, no touch points, just code and silence. "Validate this," the chairman said. The COO looked at it like it had insulted him, then back at the chairman. "What am I looking at?" "System console," the chairman replied flatly. "Legacy node. Quorum level access request. Validate." He hesitated. His fingers hovered over the keyboard like they were touching something hot. He squinted at the screen. "What's the protocol?" I leaned in from the opposite side of the table, folding my hands. "Read the syntax," I said. He tried. Truly, I think he did. The command line was straightforward, if you spoke the language. But he didn't. All those months of streamlining, consolidating, moving fast, he'd never once asked what powered the bones beneath the system, never learned the terminal commands, never cared who wrote them. He mumbled something about root access and token mismatch, then stopped, hands in his lap. I leaned forward. Quiet, patient, clinical. "It's not a trick," I said. "It's the same command I've used since the lockdown protocol was written, but it only accepts input from someone who knows what it actually means." He looked up. I could see it on his face, the understanding and the resignation buried underneath it. So I tapped the keyboard myself. "Authorize compliance, level root, sign, M. Carter, enter." The screen blinked once, then again, and then flashed green. System override accepted custodian signature verified. M. Carter validation stack, restored time 08:59:47. The chairman nodded. Back online. The silence that followed wasn't awkward. It was instructional. That kind of silence has gravity. It marks a room forever. I stood up. "You were right," I said, finally turning to the COO. "The process is a joke." He looked at me, unsure, eyebrows raised as if expecting the punchline. I gave it to him anyway. "To people like you." I didn't say it cruelly. I wasn't angry. I wasn't gloating. I just said it the way you might say a measurement out loud in a lab. A number, a reading, a truth with no emotion attached. Because that's what it was. The process isn't for the loud. It's not for the flashy. It's not a weapon or a prop or a quarterly slide. It's a spine. You don't notice it when it's working. But when it goes limp, everything else collapses. The system logs now bore my name. Every authentication trail, every root level override, every restored report. From this moment forward, all would show one line. Signed, M. Carter, Custodian Authority, Clause 14.9a, permanently. He didn't say anything as I left, just sat there staring at the cursor, still blinking, waiting for input he'd never be able to give. And for the first time since he arrived, he finally understood what it meant to have no access, no voice, no authority, only a screen that refused to listen, unless it heard the right name. The lights flickered once as the system finished its boot cycle, like the building itself had been holding its breath and finally let it out. Then the dashboard returned, not in fragments or with error codes, but in full. Reports populated, cross-chain integrity logs refreshed. The compliance queue unfroze and began to hum back to life like a machine that hadn't been powered off, just ignored too long. And at the bottom of every validation report, every restored access log, every internal memo queued during the lockdown, There it was. Compliance Custodian M. Carter, restored via Clause 14.9a. The sentence sat there like a signature carved into stone, not a watermark, not a tag, a declaration, permanent, binding, visible to every team, every board packet, every regulatory pull. Across the room, he didn't move. The COO, still technically employed, still technically in the chain, stood by the wall where he drifted after the system turned green. His hands were at his sides, fingers slightly curled like he wanted to grip something and couldn't decide what. The confidence that had carried him into this room only hours earlier had drained completely. All that was left was the posture of a man who'd realized the stage he was performing on had been dismantled beneath him. He opened his mouth once, but didn't speak. Because what could he say? He still had his badge, his title, his parking spot probably. But the system no longer needed his input. His override access was suspended. His workflow permissions routed through my desk. Even his calendar requests now passed a new filter, mine. The chairman extended his hand toward me. "Well," he said. One word, not triumphant, not performative, just final. I shook it once. Firm, not warm. No one applauded. There were no announcements, just the quiet acknowledgement that a system someone tried to erase had simply reasserted itself. I turned to leave, heels soft against the executive floor's carpet. Behind me, the screen resumed its automated reporting. System health, normal. Escalation tree, stable. Credential status, verified. Then it ticked forward once more, restoring the cycle count. But one line stayed static. COO access, pending certification. It sat there in gray text, cold and inert, waiting for a clearance level he no longer had, requiring a certification process he didn't know existed, because he'd never cared to ask. I didn't look back, didn't need to. He was still standing there when the doors shut behind me. He was still standing there when the system moved on without him, and he will be, until someone explains that the only way back in is through the very process he called a joke. But now, that process only responds to one name, and it isn't his.